Okay, I'm making this video because there is a lot of really bad information going around, particularly on Facebook, about how to implement radio in your emergency preparedness planning. There are a lot of misconceptions, and there's a lot of false information that just gets repeated and repeated and repeated. And I'd like to address it because I've been doing this for 30 years. I know what I'm talking about. I was one of the first state CERT instructors, which deals with emergency response and disaster response for the state of Delaware. And I wrote the communications module for their CERT program. I was also a Pennsylvania CERT instructor. I've been an EMT for 30 years. I've been a firefighter. I've done urban and wilderness search and rescue, and I have every FEMA certification you could ever think of. I know what I'm talking about. I'm currently an amateur general class operator, and I've been doing that 25 or so years. So when I say that this stuff is important to consider, I'm coming from a standpoint of reality and training and experience that most people tend to ignore when it comes to radio. They're just ignorant, or even worse, wishful in their thinking that everything's just going to work out just fine. And that's not the definition of preparedness, is it? If you're a prepper, you're supposed to be practicing, training, organizing, preparing, training, organizing, preparing, training, organizing. You're supposed to be ready. That's the whole point, isn't it? Be ready. But when it comes to radio, people will say things like, oh, well, when SHTF, nobody cares about the rules. You can transmit wherever you want. You might transmit wherever you want, but that's not really going to be very helpful for you, is it? If nobody's listening and nobody's communicating back to you, you didn't have a plan. That's wishful thinking. SHTF, nobody follows the rules. Do what you want. No, sure, you can do that, but it's not going to. You're not going to last very long with that, because what that means is you didn't prepare. You did nothing. It's wishful thinking. You don't know what you're doing. Radio prep should be in your top 3 most important priorities as far as preparedness, and if it isn't, you're not doing anything. So let's talk about a few of the misconceptions. First misconception is that in the case of emergency, as far as life and property, that you, without an amateur license, can transmit on amateur frequencies because life and property. And you're wrong. It's not true. The exemption for life and property applies to people that have an amateur radio license, not to people that don't, because the question becomes, what do you even have amateur radio stuff for if you're not an amateur radio operator? The exemption just means that if you have an amateur operator license, in the case of danger to life or property, you can use frequency bands that you are not normally permitted to use for the purpose of that event. It does not mean that if you're not an amateur operator, you can go ahead and use those, because that's not what the rule says. And if you don't believe me, look it up. The rule pertains to amateur operators. So, for example, if I'm only a technician class operator, it is not unreasonable that I would still have access to HF equipment, because, a technician may upgrade to general, and at that point I'd be able to use HF equipment, and it just makes sense that if I'm an amateur operator, I have access to equipment that I might not currently be licensed to use. But it's not unreasonable to say that, well, if I can't get the job done, if I can't reach help through VHF and UHF, which are the bands that I have privileges with, in this situation of life and property, I could use HF, for example, 20 meters, because I'm an amateur operator. And although I don't have privileges for those, I am an amateur operator. And so for that specific event, life or property, I can go outside of my allotment. If you don't have an amateur license, it doesn't apply to you. That's the rules. Whether you like them or not, that's the rules. It doesn't apply to you. So there is no such thing as, oh, well, when all hell breaks loose, we don't have to worry about it. Nobody's going to follow the rules. You go ahead and think that. You're going to be alone. So if you have an amateur operator license, it means that during situations like that, you can go outside your allotment of privileges, but only for that event. And if you don't have a license, that exemption doesn't involve you, because you don't have a license. And the idea that you're going to use amateur radio anyway is sort of part of your like backup plan, like, SHTF, nobody cares, I can transmit wherever I want. It's silly. You're just being silly. It's ridiculous because you're not preparing. How can you prepare for anything if you can't practice, if you can't go through the motions? Here's a picture of something that you're probably familiar with if you're a prepper. You go to the range, you practice with the weapon, you go through gobs of ammunition, prepared. Way more than you really needed to. You probably trained beyond a reasonable necessity. How are you going to do that if you're relying on amateur radio in an emergency, but because you're not licensed, you can't practice? So when it comes to, hey, I got my Baofeng radios and it's a disaster, so I'm just going to transmit wherever I want, you don't know what you're doing. You don't know how to program a Baofeng by hand in the field. You don't know what your propagation is going to be. You don't know if the radio even works because you couldn't have transmitted on it. And if you do know it works, then you did transmit on it and you broke the rules anyway, even when it wasn't necessary. You need to be able to put your communications into your planning and your regimen and your drill. It can't just be some theoretical that, hey, if so-and-so happens. That's just wishful thinking. It's wishful thinking to say, oh, just SHTF, we can do whatever we want. And you can, but that's not planning. That's not prepping. You can't call yourself a prepper if you didn't actually prepare. And so not being able to use the radio because you're just assuming you're going to use it on a frequency you're not allowed to under the right circumstances means you've done nothing. You have no idea. Clueless. You haven't done anything. When it comes to this picture, you should be putting as much effort into your radio preparedness as you are into this activity. Why wouldn't you? It's what preparing is all about. So what is a better idea? Well, amateur radio is going to be busy during a true disaster. What I think people fail to understand is that the frequencies where you're likely to find someone in amateur radio to talk to, especially in an emergency, are already going to be used by official traffic. And so you're not going to be part of that conversation anyway. You'll be ignored. When official traffic is being passed, it's done through established nets, people that have practiced. They do know their equipment, they do know their propagation, they know their protocols, and they're probably doing it digitally anyway. So there's really no voice to talk to. Those airwaves are going to be full, and you're just basically crying in the dark. It makes no sense to assume that you can use amateur radio in a disaster because you probably can't. You can try, but you're not hurting anybody but yourself. It's a bad plan. So what do you use instead? The Baofeng radio, which is really what this whole argument stems from, is that the Baofeng radio is sort of a Swiss Army knife of radios. The reason it exists is that in China, the idea is one radio to rule them all. They'll make one cheap radio that can be used in all of the services, whether it's transportation, telecommunications, construction, business, whatever. One radio that can do it all. They can use it all throughout China. And because it's China, you don't mess around. If you break the rules, it's not something you probably want to do. And so people are basically going to follow the rules to use the radio where they're allowed to use it for the purposes they're allowed to use it. And it just kind of makes sense then. One radio made cheap, everybody can use it. That's just the way they see it. But when you export that radio to any other place, that's not how things work. We get into things like type acceptance and all that. So the Baofeng is not so much an amateur radio. It's just a radio. It's a Swiss Army knife of radios. I would prefer people not to think of it as an amateur radio because it does so much more. And thinking of it as an amateur radio is just automatically limiting yourself to very few choices as far as to how to implement your communications. The Baofeng can do GMRS, which technically you should have a license for, but even if you don't, you can still use FRS to practice, to implement your radio strategy, to test it. And then in that SHTF situation, sure, I guess, with GMRS, you can go full power in a disaster because, hey, that exemption does apply to you. Doesn't apply in amateur radio. That applies in GMRS. So whether you have a license or not, you could use it, and you could test it, and you can mess with it. And if you have a license, even better. Mirrors, there's no license requirement whatsoever. Bofung will do this too. Between GMRS and Mures, you're covered for UHF and VHF, which is the two things in the amateur radio spectrum that the Bofung can also do. But you don't need amateur license to use either of these two bands, so why not use them? They're available. That's what they're there for. 20 years ago, I would have said never include CB radio in your emergency communications plan, because at the time it wasn't a good idea. It was still being used and abused to a degree that in an emergency, that's what everybody's going to turn to. It's just going to be a big cluttered mess. CB is a mess on a good day. Can't imagine what it would be on a bad day. But in 20 years, things have changed, and nobody uses CB anymore. And, if you're like a CB enthusiast, you're going to jump on it and say, oh, we use it, whatever. You don't. Nobody uses CB anymore. It's a very small market. And of the market that does exist, it's DX. The reason I mention it, though, is that because no one's using it, there's a really good opportunity there for your communications plan, because there's your HF. You've got your UHF, your VHF, and CB can be your HF, and it does travel farther than UHF and VHF, so it's sort of your intermediate range communication, and not enough people use it that I would really worry about excessive traffic. Things have changed in 20 years, and so I think that CB radio actually is now a good thing. And if you take a look, like how many GMRS radios and how many CB radios are out there in the public, billions. They're a very good backbone communication, because they're everywhere. They're all over the place. So there are good places for you to use your Bofung and implement your emergency communication strategy to the point that you can actually practice it and know how it's going to perform, without just saying, well, when SHTF, nobody cares, because that's not going to work. That's not preparedness. That's wishful thinking. I'm trying to convey some useful information. I'm just tired of somebody, on Facebook telling the newcomer, oh, yeah, you don't have to worry about the rules when it comes to it. The Bofung can tune into thousands and thousands of individual frequencies at a 25K spread. Good luck. If you don't understand how radio works and what the bands are, you're just shooting in the dark. You have no idea what you're doing. These are things that, as part of your preparedness plan, you should understand and know, and be able to practice in real time, in real life, not just some theoretical. So, end of rant. I hope it's been somewhat useful and sort of an opportunity to think through this process of what's actually a useful implementation of radio, rather than just assuming that the rest of the world is going to make way for you so that you can get your information through on whatever band or frequency that you choose. It's just, that's not real. It doesn't work that way. Engage the algorithm. Feel free to complain, comment, whatever you like. And 7-3.